Hello everyone, and today we're going to look at the concept of weak squares in chess. Weak squares are those squares it can be present either in your camp or your opponent's structure where a piece can settle there. Uh, Basically, a piece of either your own or your opponent's, depending on who has the weak square, and the piece will be extremely dominating there and will be very difficult to remove. And these weak squares will also make sure that your position will be very bad in the situation, especially during the game where basically where the weak squares are present, the pawn or the piece in front of it will be extremely weak and will be vulnerable to attacks quickly and easily. So these weak squares are necessary to be learned by intermediate and beginner players who are either just starting the game or they are in the middle of learning the game of chess, and they have to improve their uh, knowledge about these weak squares and understanding about it in order to make plan or take advantage of their opponent's weak squares during a game. So, without further wasting any time, let's begin. What is a weak square? So, in our first position, which we are going to see, which is this position, as we can see, has many weak squares. I can tell you to pause your video and figure out which are weak squares in the game, in the position. And you can either comment down below or you can point it out by yourself. And let me tell, here the weak squares are usually always before the weak pawns. So any weak pawn, which we have learned the concept of weak pawns and pieces in our previous videos, we know that the squares in front of them are always weak. For example, the weak pawns here in black's camp are the a7 and a6 pawns, the c6 pawn, and these weak pawns in the yeah, and there are also weak pawns in the white's camp, which is like the h3 and h2 pawn, the f2 pawn, and these weak pawns always possess a weak square in front of it. For example, here, as we can predict, the weak square here is the a5 square, and weak square here is the c5 square. Similarly, the weak square in white's camp is the h4 square and even the f3 square. So these weak squares, what they do, they allow the opponent to make sure that these squares can be occupied by piece or the pieces, depending on the situation of your opponent, and can be used for infiltration or positional domination during the game. So avoiding such weak squares is extremely necessary. So in order to avoid, especially for beginners, in order to avoid any kind of weak squares, please avoid any kind of bad pawn structure that you can have, like for example, the double pawn in black and white scale respectively here, which is the h2 and h3 pawn and f2 pawn. It's isolated and double pawns here, and here similarly here in a7 and a6 and within c6 pawn in the black camp. And avoiding such pawn structure will help you not create any kind of weak squares for it. But there are actually two types of weak squares instead of one. One kind of weak square is an absolute weak square, which is extremely easy to see for any kind of player, especially who are beginning and can easily understand them, which are like this, the example which I gave, a5 and c5 squares in black skin. and similarly h4 and f3 squares in white scale. Similarly, there are another kind of weak squares, which is a potential weak square. And a potential weak square is a square which may not be weak now, but in the further game, when the game progresses, can be occupied smartly by a player, by the pieces of a player, and can be made weak in the process. For example, if I give you here in black's camp, even though we know that the king is on the g7 square, the h6 and the f6 squares are actually weak. It might be a little bit confusing for our beginner players, but these squares are weak because in future, if this king leaves the square of g7 and tries to go somewhere else, then this can become a potential weakness and can be occupied by white's pieces. Similarly, in white's camp also, there are weaknesses like a4, b3, and c4. Even though they are not weak now, they can be occupied by one of the bishop or knight of blacks and can be rendered weak in future if white is not careful. So this kind of squares which are not weak right now but has the potential to be weak are called as potential weak squares. And intermediate players should look out for such squares because this kind of weak squares are very potential of being occupied and can be used easily for infiltration into opponent's camp. So these weak squares have to be uh, look out for. Beginner players can rewind the video and again listen to what I'm saying. It's a very important concept. They can watch the video again and again until you understand. And intermediate players can easily get it, and they can use this concept in their own games in order to improve their uh, plans of like trying to infiltrate into your opponent's position. So, after discussing about the weak squares, let's see some positions where the weak square concepts are more prominent and can be used. So, the next position we are going to look out is this position. Here, black has taken the pawn on the e5 square. If I'm right? Yeah, it's the e5 square. And now, what should be the best move according to white? I can give you time to pause the video and think about it a little bit. And those of you who have found the answer, they're extremely good at it. And yes, the best move is obviously rook takes on e5. And why is that so? Because the e6 pawn will always be weak in the process. This e6 pawn will be a backward pawn forever and can be used in order to put more pressure on black's position. Why? If we go back a little bit and now if we play the move d takes on e5, this is a very bad move because the pawn is now in front of the e6 pawn and cannot be attacked anymore. And this makes sure that the e6 pawn is not weak anymore and black will be fine after this. So this kind of situation, especially the intermediate and the beginner players should look out for, of not filling the weak squares with their pawns. Instead, they should fill, right, to place the pieces in such squares. The pieces of yours belong to the weak squares of your opponent. So it was obviously said by Sigbert Tarash that the weak squares of your opponent are like cavities and they should be occupied by pieces. Occupying them with pawns is like taking your opponent to the dentist and filling up their cavity. So you should give a lot of pain to your opponent, trying to fill up those weak squares and not letting them breathe easily. As this weak square has to be continuously uh, what's it, monitored, and the weak pawn behind it or in front of it has to be continuously protected by opponent, giving them no space or no place to improve themselves that easy. So that is this kind of weakness has to be taken care of. And in the next position, which we are going to see, will be an even better position to look out for, which is this position. This is little bit tougher than you can think of. It is actually black to play. If I say, let me just flip the board. Yeah, this is black to play and figure out what can be the best move here for black. So whoever found the answer, great. And those who could not find it or could not figure it out, it is obviously bishop to d5, sorry, bishop to d4, check. And then after the king moves, we play the move here. You might think what this does. This does two things. First thing, we are cementing this kind of structure for ourselves and not letting white breathe, which means that these, if we can see a little bit closely, this structure of whites, which has all his pawns on the light squares, is making it difficult for the light square bishop of whites to move free. And what we have done by pushing this pawn in front of our queen is that we have made sure that this pawn will never move in its lifetime and will always remain in the f3 position, and which means this bishop will always be caged under the pawns. It will be completely tombed inside its own pawn chain, and it will almost be like we black pieces are playing with one extra piece, while the pieces of white has one bishop rendered completely useless. And this will be extremely easy for black to convert. Black just has to start an attack on the white's king, and obviously white will be very, it will be very difficult for white to make sure that uh, there will be any kind of defense, as the black the black bishop on the dark squares is extremely dominating compared to its counterpart on the e2 square. So finally we come to the conclusion, and this is the position which I am going to give it to you, and please figure out a solution to this position and try to comment or try to figure out the solution by making sure that the weakness is really created in this situation for white, and in order to give black a huge advantage. That's the hint. So that is it for today. I hope you have enjoyed and understood the concept of weak squares, and bye bye.